Hello, everybody. It's actually really good to see so many people in here to look at what we're going to discuss today, which is the study that was conducted at Addenbrooke's Hospital. The study is now finished. It's in its final stages of data collection for the final ward, which has now ceased. Myself, I'm the founder and CEO of Air Purity UK, so my involvement in this is purely from a technological standpoint. So I'm going to discuss a bit of the journey to start off with and where we've got to. Dr. Butler will then start to share some of the findings today. We can't share all of the findings. This will be almost a piecemeal exercise. We're trying to keep this presentation quite short and sweet, so there's lots of time for questions. But we do have also a stall if you want to ask some more questions at the end and potentially maybe see a little bit more data that we can't share openly today. So just to give an insight on the Addenbrooke's air disinfection study, there was lots of questions we wanted to try and find the answers to, but trying to simplify it into really sort of two broad points was, can we actually correlate environmental factors to infections, so indoor air quality being the main thing. And how do we measure this? What's the risk? What is good? Where do we intervene? So starting to identify, but asking the right questions for the NHS to learn lessons from this and potentially adopt in their own trusts. There were lots of challenges to do this. Firstly, how can we get a positive outcome? So what were the hurdles for that? Developing a technology that's going to give the best chance for results. And how do we design something where, if we do have positive outcomes, that can be used for other trusts, either through a research stage or implementation stage? And start to ask the questions, what does best practice look like? That's hard at this stage because a lot of this study is novel. A lot of the technology we've developed is novel. But it gives at least a good baseline of what we can achieve and what we could look to do in the future. So one of the issues around air is at all heights. It doesn't matter if it's at breathing height, floor height, ceiling, it is everywhere. It moves, and we will show that today. It gives some context later on through Matt and then myself at the end. But taking this just an example, you can take a surface swab at just about any height and you can generally find something. So we had to find a way to at least try and solve this problem at all heights. So what we decided to do is build air cleaners that would basically clear floor to ceiling. And the reason for that is if we are seeing aerosols migrate, is that we're stopping them at multiple points instead of at just one point. And also gathering real-world data. So to support the study, the units will have to gather data, understand when they're switched off, when they're switched on, and how they're performing as well. Milestones, continue on the milestones. We also needed to map how aerosols move. So this was something novel in itself. There's a few researchers in the audience that have been a great contributor and help to this. And basically starting to understand, well, if we implement air quality sensors, what does that look like? What is the risks of a potential air quality reading? And then also correlate that with what microorganisms are in the air. So if we're seeing aerosol movements through indoor air quality monitors, what structurally is in the air? So here's a really good example of an air sampler from the study. And you can see, I will try and point, 0 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours. And you can see the dirt build up after 48 hours. We take that to the labs and then we get the results, which Matt will now start to talk about.
Thank you, Darren. So had I've known that I was going to be talking in such a large room 2 years ago, well, 3 years ago now, I think I maybe have gone on a different path. But I just thought I'd give you some context on why is a geriatrician stood up in front of you now. So we all have gone through COVID. I was on Addenbrooke's Hospital in our COVID infection unit, and I I'm sorry to say, the only ever infection control guidance I've ever read was the COVID-19 guidance. And I think this is a tip for all of you that are writing guidance. Make your title red and bold, and then you'll grab our attention. And I think, like many doctors, actually, we were worried about what was going on, what we were seeing in other hospitals, particularly looking over to Italy. And obviously, what China did, being the main manufacturer of PPE, was that when they had the big problem, they effectively told everyone to stop exporting. So we started to run into PPE problems. But luckily in Addenbrooke's, being leafy sort of Cambridge, we actually had quite a bit of time to prepare. So we're not too far from London, so our ICUs were taking lots of transfers from London hospitals, but we did actually have a lot of time to get our guidance, get our training up to speed, and that's where effectively I got involved, because I'm more of a human factors person. I'm very much in my day job, I sort of do function with my patients and look at how to sort of better optimize them, get them home into their home environment. So thinking then about how does staff use the PPE, how do they dispose of it, how do they don it, how do they doff it, I could see, actually, knowing how chaotic my ward was, that it needed a lot of education. So that's where I mainly focused on. And this lovely gentleman, because Addenbrooke's was basically one of the only places with ICU space, we were also one of the only hospitals that allowed the BBC in really early on in the pandemic. So here's me showing Hugh Pym round our COVID infection unit. And interestingly, when he put on the surgical mask, he said to me, are you sure this is protective? And I was, oh yes, very, very much sure, very much sure. This is when I was less au fait with airborne. Before I'd met wonderful people like Dr. Peters and Professor Beggs in the audience that quickly disabused me of that. So, coming on, so what we did first of all in Addenbrooke's, we're very, very lucky in that we're right down the road from Wellcome, so we have lots of sort of genome sort of sequencing laboratories around. And Chris Illingworth and others basically wanted to look at who's infecting who. And the way he did that very cleverly was to look at the differences in the mutations between different people's swabs. So effectively, if someone had only a couple of mutations different, then you knew that actually there weren't many steps between that person infecting that other person. And also then taking in time of symptom onset, time of taking the swab, you can infer directionality. And effectively what we showed, with white circles being the patients and grey circles being the healthcare workers, is that actually patients mainly infect other patients. So if you look at the pie chart on that side, so most of the time, 90% of the time plus, patients are infecting other patients. So it's all well and good sort of putting your staff in masks, but we know how difficult it is to get our patients to mask. And interestingly, if you listen to sort of what most people were saying early on in the pandemic with sort of staff acquisition of infection, that it being community-based, we were getting it at homes, actually that's not the case. Most of the transmission is in hospital, and most of the transmission is well, it's 50-50 around about. So quite a lot of staff are getting infected from other staff members, usually at dinner times and break times, but also a significant proportion of staff were getting infected by the patients that they were looking after. And unfortunately, COVID has really shown the massive weakness in the NHS, that our inability to control pathogens that spread primarily through the air. So this is just a line graph taking the whole course of the pandemic, and it's effectively just showing you what percentage of patients with COVID caught it in the hospitals that are meant to be looking after them. So you can see, actually at the beginning, when pretty much we're all locked down, not too bad. Obviously there's the first wave, this is Delta coming in, and then we continue to lock down over Christmas. But then since then, we've been on this inexorable rise to, like C. diff, like norovirus. Actually, COVID is now pretty much a nosocomial disease. And actually, if you look at the first wave of the pandemic, hospital-acquired cases prolonged lockdown by about 2 weeks. So it's significant when we're looking at hospital-acquired infection. And just to air our dirty laundry, so Addenbrooke's is that little arrow there. If you'd like to know where your trust is, I'm obviously not going to name and shame anyone down here, but if you are interested in knowing where you sort of are in the English NHS trusts, if you are from England, then do come and see us on the stand and we can show you this data. But essentially, some trusts are doing very well, with around about sort of a 0.2% sort of 7-day risk of people acquiring COVID. And then obviously there are some trusts that are doing less well, almost a 20-fold increase in risk. And wherever in the NHS you see that variability, you know that there's something you can do. Because there's something that here, it doesn't actually take much for you to do to get down to the middle of the pack. It's a lot harder when you're in this middle section, because that often depends on your building. But there are still things that we can do to improve. So some of the things that we can improve is start to think about COVID being an airborne pandemic, but not only COVID, all the respiratory viruses. And this is a paper that myself, Christine Peters, who's in the audience, and Professor Lawton from Bradford did, where we effectively just dichotomized trusts into those that were using some form of airborne protection, be that HEPA, be that FFP3 respirators, and then those that didn't. And you can see that actually there's a significant reduction in nosocomial cases for those trusts that, I'm not saying this is causation, obviously this is an association, but it's fairly significant, this association. And my challenge to anyone that says, well, this is purely just modelling, is to, well, you've got to come up with a reasonable sort of hypothesis as to why this difference occurs. And some of the hypotheses that were generated were around sort of building age. We actually showed that how much community transmission there wasn't related, how much COVID there was in the hospital wasn't related, and the only thing that we found that was significant was the use of airborne mitigations. So obviously we now all know about the hierarchy of controls. I didn't know before COVID, but I certainly do now. The thing which has always irked me a little bit about the hierarchy of controls is this sort of most effective, least effective, because when you are face-to-face with someone, there's no amount of ventilation that's going to stop you getting infected unless you put the filter right in front of you. Unless possibly far UV, so there's some stands talking about far UV. Kath Noakes, if you don't know her, she's definitely worth a follow. She talks about far UV being possibly one of the only environmental measures as a mitigation that might mitigate that short-range transmission. But you do need, obviously, a filtering face mask respirator for that. And at Adam Brooks, we showed that there was a significant reduction in staff acquisition of COVID on those wards, down to around zero acquisition, a 30-fold reduction. But when you're talking about environmental sort of mitigations and engineering controls, we're not just talking about airborne pathogens, so the small sort of bioaerosols that transmit things like flu, COVID, RSV, MERS, SARS. We're also talking about all those other things that are aerially disseminated. And we've had some sort of good talks, just at the one previously, where they were talking about detecting various pathogens from the air. What we're seeing now is that actually a lot of infections that cause surgical site infections and UTIs, potentially one route of that is this aerial dissemination, whereby it's in the air and it settles. So if you didn't go to Decon UK, Amy Bowden, IPC Amy on Twitter, gave a fantastic talk on their experience of doing engineering controls. And actually there was lots in there that I didn't know about, which things, all the evidence base going back donkey's years about aerial dissemination for some quite important pathogens. So I'm not going to dwell on those too much. But just to say, so the image I took this video about 4 days ago. My daughter, bless her, she's 10, but she has quite bad eczema. And I'm the person that has to do her socks and her laundry. And this is what happened when I inverted one of her socks. I don't know whether you can see that. I'll just go back and then flick it on again. These are all the skin flakes that came out of the sock as I was doing the laundry. And the photograph on the right-hand side is an electron scanning microscope of the skin. And you can see not only is there a lovely hair follicle there, you can see all these plates, these skin squames that will readily float in the air. They're perfectly designed to act like parachutes. And all of these spheres are staphylococci. And on one skin squame, which floats in the air and can travel way more than 2 meters, you can get up to 100 staphylococci. So there's no wonder that things that are aerially disseminated can cause infections that we don't necessarily traditionally treat as airborne or aerially disseminated. So just to talk about the study, so this has been my baby for 2 years. So we're lucky at Addenbrooke's in that we've got lots of geriatricians, we've got lots of old people in Cambridge. Study sites 1 and 2 are our 6th floor wards. They were our intervention wards. But unlike most IPC studies, we were really keen to do a controlled study. So effectively, every time we did an intervention, we took another ward that we didn't do the intervention on and then watched both wards over time. And we have a study that's extending beyond 48 months for all these 4 wards. Effectively, what we did, these are our 2 wards in top-down view, but we deployed lots of air cleaners, 6 air cleaners on each ward as a staggered intervention. One ward ran from September 21 to September 22, and the other ward ran from March 22 to March 23, so it's only just closed. But what we also did is we did lots of air sampling and surface sampling. So if you want to have a go at air sampling, I can show you how. I mean, if I can do it, it's definitely idiot-proof. But we did air sampling as well as 3 surface swabs. So we swabbed a sink, we swabbed a non-contact large horizontal surface, i.e. the floor, and then we also swabbed a sterile area that was used for drug prep. And not only that, but we coupled it with lots of air quality sensors. So one of the questions we wanted to ask was, with something that's cheap, as in a particle counter or a CO2 monitor, can you use that as a surrogate for an infection risk? So we're hoping with time that we'll be able to marry sort of simple measures of how clean the air is with actually what we can see effectively if we clean the air. And also what we're hoping, which is coming soon, is that we can show for a whole host of infections, and there's already signs of this in our first study ward, that for things like all the respiratory viruses, norovirus, C. diff, COVID, but some of the rarer organisms, but also things like length of stay, mortality, antibiotic spend. We're hoping that we can show statistical difference between the 2 wards. We are a little bit underpowered for that, so anything we do see will be a bonus, but at least we're hoping to see a trend in that direction. Just to tell you a little bit about what I talked about the microbiology sampling. So this is for Staph aureus. So if we concentrated just on the graph on the left, I know someone was saying earlier they sort of shudder at the sign of a graph, but this is very simply a scatter plot on the y-axis is if it was in the air. And what we've done here, so for those that know PCR, the lower the CT value, the more there is, because it's the fewer cycles you need to do to detect it. So we've essentially just flipped that round and done the inverse of that. So an increase on this graph is essentially more stuff. So things that go up on this axis and go up on the x-axis show this is the surface and this is the air. And what you can see is there's this nice linear relationship. So essentially, the more stuff we detect in the air, the more stuff we detect on the surfaces. And that's true for Staph aureus. It's true for Acinetobacter. It's true for Candida. And it's true for E. coli. So how many of those would you have said, actually, there's a problem with the air? You would have usually said things like E. coli, maybe more contact, UTI, spread by urine. But what we're effectively saying is that we can detect these things in the air in quite high concentrations. In fact, if you look at the bar on the right-hand side, we're actually detecting more in the air than we would do in the sink or on the worktop. And then actually, we're seeing similar sort of levels. So just to sort of take you back on the bar graphs, the ones on the left of here, this is air, this is worktop, sterile worktop where drug prep happens, this is sink, and then this is floor. The last one's always the filthiest. So you can see in all of them. Acinetobacter pretty much the same throughout, which is interesting. And then in Candida, more in the air and more on the floor. And then similarly for E. coli, more on the air, more on the floor. And then, so that was done just over 2 weeks. That first bit was actually from an orthogeriatric ward. This is taking the whole of the study period. So this is 6 months worth of air and surface sampling. And if it's highlighted in a colour, it effectively shows that at some point through the whole of the study, we detected it. And you can see all of the things that we were seeing. So lots of gram-negatives, lots of gram-positives, lots of, on the next slide. Interestingly, the respiratory viruses, I think mainly because they're in sort of terms when you're comparing a virus to a bacterium, they're relative weaklings, so they'll degrade quite quickly, they'll become non-viable reasonably quickly. We saw them less so, but effectively what we were seeing, it was lots of contamination throughout all of those things. And if you think about we've all heard about this concept of air being soup, that actually if you imagine sort of sealing up a ward and filling it with water, anything that's in that space will be potentially contaminated by the air. And the only thing that I can think of that links the floor, the sink, and the worktop is the air, because you don't walk with your hands on the floor, so you don't traditionally get sort of hand contamination to the floor, so that sort of takes out sort of hands as a main route to floor contamination. You also then don't walk either in the sink or on the worktop, so floor contamination to sort of higher level surfaces doesn't happen. But the thing that does make contact with all of those bits is obviously the air. So Darren is now going to show you some real-life particulate monitoring and how you can use that as a surrogate for how clean your air is. And hopefully we'll be able to show that that is as good a marker as well as using all these microbiology.
Thanks, Matt. So hopefully, contextually, you can see how important the air is. So we're going to show 3 slides. The first one being some real data of a patient fall and how that aerosol moves. The second one being actually something that is published in the Journal of Hospital Infection. So we've taken all of the data and again put that into a video, so it's quite easy to visualize. And then the third one will be something that you'd see on the stand, but really what potentially best practice is looking like. Certainly at the moment, that will it'll be fairly self-explanatory, but I'll try and talk through it. So on with the first video. So we're taking actual real-life data from the sensors scattered throughout this ward, and this was the very first time we actually placed sensors into a ward and left them, and we can see. Oh, has it got the weird music?
Apologies, that was...
You said that the music was out.
Yeah, I think yeah. I'm hearing piano music.
Oh, okay. Anyway, so you can see, so in A and B, these should be positive pressured areas, so actually aerosol shouldn't really be migrating in there. So that was quite relevant as well, looking at the ward as itself as being one entire environment. So when you can conceptually start to understand what Matt was showing in terms of the different strains moving through the air, that actually it affects everywhere. So it's affecting the air, it's affecting the surfaces, it's affecting the floors, it's affecting the sinks. So we really, really have to start to look at, well, how can we visualize this? How can we start to identify risk? What does it look like? Because we can't air sample 24/7. I don't really know what the cost would be, whether it would be worth it. So we need to think of ways where we can actually pragmatically look at something in a very simplistic way. Well, this isn't simplistic, but in a way that we can all identify and start to action some interventions. The second video, so this one in the top, this was day 1 with a unit on, and then it was switched off, and day 2, the unit was continuously on. So we can see when the unit was switched off in day 1, this is, I'll replay this video, but on the top left pane, this is very, very fine particulates and also CO2. So you do see a strong correlation between CO2 and particulates. And on day 2, we can see that the unit's on, but there is still some significance in terms of CO2 levels and particulate levels. So this was quite important because it was a natural experiment and we could see the effects of the units on and the units off, but it also gives an idea of what the limitations were. So when we go back to the decision on cleaning at all heights, we could see this unit was very powerful and it could clean half a ward, but we could make it better. And I'll just repeat that video one time again, is that you'll see down on day 2 that there was a raise in day 2, and we decided to put the units in the bays as well, which I think had a very big impact on the results. So this is quite a powerful tool, and I think really if anybody's got air cleaners already in their trust, you could use this to start to understand what impact they're having. So that's really conceptually something that we've aimed to achieve from this study, because you can't just have these units placed everywhere. Hospitals are going to go down different routes. You can use it for ventilation auditing as well. So if there is a change in ventilation, you will be able to see it. I'll just skip now. So this is really what we think best practice is looking like today. So we've taken all of the learnings, and I'll just let the video play. But conceptually, what we're trying to ascertain is, can we validate and verify pre and post? And how do we measure that? How do we continuously ensure that what we're actually actioning is taking place? So it's a multitude of things. We do have to start to understand what the current ventilation, mechanical ventilations are looking like in the wards, or if it's naturally ventilated. Before we can start anything, where the position you could place an intervention, what the indoor air quality is looking like, because again, that could be a surrogate for risk. Well, we know it's going to be a surrogate for risk. And then the options of surface swabbing and air sampling as well. Let's tie it up and see the difference, and then eventually start to understand what impact that has on infections. So this is actually a 3D model of an actual ward that we've installed at Addenbrooke's. So it's a Nightingale ward, but in terms of the bays, they're very much isolated. So the idea is to make sure that we're controlling the corridor spaces so that any aerosols that are moving out, they are cleaned and not moving into bays. And it has been a resounding success. And we've kind of really come up with an acronym as seen here. And it really sort of envisioned, it just ties up everything that we've had to go through over the last 3 years. We need to, I'm going to leave with a few points that maybe help you, and we can do this in the Q&A, of some lessons learned through the development steps and implementation, which are really relevant. And one of them is sort of education and stakeholder buy-in. We can have the best equipment in the world, but if you're not educating your staff members, if you're not having the buy-in from all levels, clinical, IPC, estates, facilities management, it's very, very difficult. I've kind of scrubbed out all of the sort of details so people can't really identify these units, but it's just an idea of some of the trusts that we've seen where they're sort of put in a corner, they're neglected, or they're not switched on. So it is still a problem. I think we've seen a lot of trusts that have tried to do the right thing and put something in, but whether it's due to noise or just the lack of buy-in or education, that is a real challenge that the NHS is going to face as these are going to be deployed. The other probably important thing as well is when consideration is health and safety, it's going to be there will be a bigger focus on this. I mean, there is a unit to the left here, don't know if you can see. These are all sharp edges. The filters are kind of held on by springs. So you certainly would not want that anywhere. I mean, the amount of injury that could cause, let alone being a biohazard. But again, it's actually unplugged. So, and when asking what it is, a lot of staff didn't know what it was. So again, it's about that. But the more worrying thing is there's an actual sticker that was approved by estates. So estates they've accepted that's something that is acceptable to be on the ward. So we still have a long way to go in that regard. Here's what best practice certainly is starting to look like. So that's quite a poor picture of myself, but it's about dealing with filters. It's about dealing with the maintenance side. Now, not every system has filters. There's a whole separate discussion on that. But again, it's starting to think about if these units are going in, what is the burden within the trust? What responsibilities must they hold? And what responsibilities must the supplier hold for this to work? That's me. We've got some East London Foundation Trust members in the audience that we're working with. So it's really a shout out to them, because the next steps after what we've done at Addenbrooke's is the Mental Health Trust, so looking at ligature risks and other aspects. And they've really been a flag bearer, and we will see a lot of work and information coming through their comms, through talks on what we're doing there to enable a fair and equal opportunity for all trusts to have the same privileges with air quality. So really, really important. And the final slide, Matt, I'll let you do the thank yous.
Just on that point as well, there was some good data that Callum Semple did looking at mental health trusts. Actually, if you think of the type of buildings we have where we have secondary care facilities, mental health facilities are obviously less well equipped than we are for infection control. They're often in older buildings, they often have less access to clinicians or testing, so their outbreaks actually were bigger. So it's really good that this sort of work's led on to that work with ELFT. But I wouldn't be here not for all of these amazing people. We're now 20, I think I count 21 people that are in some, and this is not even sort of the staff that have actually been helping us keep these units running, educating the patients about them. So particular mention in the audience, if you've got any microbiology questions, don't direct them to me, direct them to Dr. Peters or to Professor Beggs, who are sort of aerobiologists par excellence. But actually, the two main people I want to thank are these two wonderful ladies. I think, where's Rachel? Are you in the audience? There's Rachel. Rachel Thaxter and Christine Moody. So Christine Moody actually put me in touch with Darren, many for my sins, I know. But what they were willing to do when no one else was willing to do it in the country was put their neck out, firstly to do FFP3, and we showed that worked, but also just to put their neck out and say, there's not a lot about whether we should be doing HEPA, but to really stick their neck out and say, let's just give it a go. And actually, I commend them. I couldn't thank them enough because for me, as someone who'd been almost sort of hitting roadblocks all the time, seeing that this thing might help, I didn't even know whether it would help. But the early signs are that we're seeing that actually if you clean the air, you can actually stop the things getting onto the surface. And we've all heard about, I was at Decon UK with Darren last week, and learning about sort of dry biofilm and how resistant it is, and the things are there for years. Actually, a much better way of dealing with biofilm is to stop it forming in the first place and to stop these things going through the air, landing on surfaces, and then having to be cleaned off. Big thank you to you, Rachel, and thank you for sticking with us post your retirement. So I hope we don't cause you to lose your hair too much.